try to be sincere, when you try to be natural, you know jolly well that you're trying and that everything you do is a fake. And so in the same way, the Zen student finds out that he cannot act 100% genuinely with his whole being. And he gets frustrated again and again and again as the teacher rejects every attempt he makes to show him his real self. Until the moment comes when he suddenly realizes, not just as an idea, but something that he knows in his whole body, he knows with his very bones, that it can't be done. You cannot intentionally be natural. And he gives up. And that moment of giving up is just the same as when the student of the sword gives up trying to prepare to defend himself. And in the moment when we let go of ourselves in that way, zoop, there comes upon us this experience of the void, of complete freedom, or as we might say in psychological language, being free from blocking. You know, blocking is when you are stalled by something. When somebody says something to you that fundamentally embarrasses you, or when an event happens in life which, as it were, knocks the wind out of your sails, you are blocked. And to be free from blocking, to be free from being stopped, being phased, is part of the Satori experience. The Zen way of teaching teaches one to see that you cannot be in complete control of your whole life situation. You cannot, in other words, fundamentally possess yourself. And so they set you the problem of trying to find out who you are. Who is the knower behind all your experience? Who is the experiencer? Who is the ego, the I? And they make you search for it and search for it and search for it. Or you could put this in another way. They ask you, and this really amounts to the same thing, act with total sincerity. Show me, in the Zen way of putting it, who you were before your father and mother conceived you. In other words, show me your real, basic, original self. And this means perform an absolutely 100% genuine and sincere act. Well, you know how it is when you try to be sincere. When you try to be natural, you know jolly well that you're trying and that everything you do is a fake. And so in the same way, the Zen student finds out that he cannot act 100% genuinely with his whole being. And he gets frustrated again and again and again as the teacher rejects every attempt he makes to show him his real self. Until the moment comes when he suddenly realizes, not just as an idea, but something that he knows in his whole body, he knows with his very bones, that it can't be done. You cannot intentionally be natural. And he gives up. And that moment of giving up is just the same as when the student of the sword gives up trying to prepare to defend himself. And in the moment when we let go of ourselves in that way, zoop, there comes upon us this experience of the void, of complete freedom, or as we might say in psychological language, being free from blocking. You know, blocking is when you are stalled by something. When somebody says something to you that fundamentally embarrasses you, or when an event happens in life which, as it were, knocks the wind out of your sails, you are blocked. And to be free from blocking, to be free from being stopped, being phased, is part of the Satori experience. The Zen way of teaching teaches one to see that you cannot be in complete control of your whole life situation. You cannot, in other words, fundamentally possess yourself. And so they set you the problem of trying to find out who you are. Who is the knower behind all your experiences? Who is the experiencer? And they make you search for it and search for it and search for it. Or you could put this in another way.
Back.
They ask you, and this really amounts to the same thing. And with total sincerity,
Loki fathered a monstrous
show
wolf
me,
named Fenrir.
in the Zen way of putting it, who you were before your father and mother conceived you. In other words, show me your real, basic, original self.
Imagine making $453,000 in a single month as an affiliate marketer without...
And sincere act. Well, you know how it is. Will you try?
Welcome to Being in the Way. I'm your host, Mark Watts, and this is the Alan Watts Podcast. And today we're going to listen to a really great talk. It was recorded in Ojai, California, and it's called Zen and the Art of the Controlled Accident. And it really dives deeply into my father's aesthetic appreciation of Zen. And to celebrate this, we've also created a new web presence called The Art of Alan Watts. And you can find it linked from the alanwatts.org website. But you'll be able to experience some of the materials that inspired him, and then also contemporary interpretations and posters and all of that. So in this way, we're celebrating my father's appreciation of Zen aesthetics, and invite you to join us to look around and see what's going on. And so now for today's podcast, Zen and the Art of the Controlled Accident, recorded in Ojai, California. Here's Alan Watts.
I have entitled this seminar, Zen Buddhism and the Art of Controlled Accidents. And this is going to involve not only the aesthetic domain of the arts, but also what we might call spontaneity in living. And so I've got to begin by going back to the earliest source of Zen, which is not actually Buddhism, but the Chinese philosophy known as Taoism. The way of the Tao, that is spelled in English T-A-O, but by Mandarin speakers pronounced approximately Tao. The scholars who transliterated these words had a way of transliterating them so that only if you were in the know and were a scholar could you pronounce them properly. They might just as well have spelled it D-A-O or D-O-W. Now, in order to understand Taoism, which originates in China, probably later than Confucius, about 400 BC, although the materials out of which this philosophy was evolved probably go back very much further. The Tao is a way of life, and the word Tao means the way. Approximately, the course of nature, the flow of things. And in order to understand this point of view, we have to make a very, very radical adjustment in our ordinary common sense. Not all Chinese people by any means understand this, but it has, in a way, leaked into the general culture of China over the centuries, so that even, so, shall we say, the man in the street has some glimmer of what it's about. But it involves one absolutely radical transformation in our ordinary, everyday common sense. And I have to explain this from the beginning. Because Zen and Taoism in common involve not a system of doctrine, not a set of beliefs as we ordinarily understand religion. They involve a transformation of your consciousness. That is to say, of the way in which you experience your own existence at every moment. One might say that the average individual, not only in the West but also in the East, has a feeling of himself as separate from other people and from the earth itself and from the space and the stars and everything around the earth. He feels this in such a way that it's expressed in all the phrases of common speech. We talk about coming into the world. I came into this world. As a matter of fact, you didn't. You came out of it. Just in the same way as an apple comes out of an apple tree, as an expression of the apple tree. We say, I'm facing facts. As if facts, that is to say, the things going on in nature around you, were something you confronted as a being alien from, different from those facts, and meeting them as if they were total strangers. We talk about the conquest of nature as a phrase expressing man's control over his environment, which is a very hostile phrase. Now, in order to get the Chinese point of view, may I be so simple as to take you back to the old lesson about the bees and the flowers. Not to illustrate how sex works, but to illustrate the very fundamental property of nature. There are no flowers where there are no insects. There are no insects where there are no flowers. They go together. Just in the same way as your head goes with your feet, or as the head of a cat goes with the tail of a cat, except in the case of Manx cats that don't have tails. But ordinarily, if you were watching a cat walking, and you'd never seen a cat before, and you were looking at it through a narrow crack in a fence, you would see first the head, and then the tail. Then the cat would turn around and walk past again, and you would see first the head, and then the tail. And you might assume that your experience of the head of the cat was one event, and the tail was another event. That they would be separate from each other, but they would be related as cause to effect. But if your crack in the fence were widened, you would see it was all one cat, and that the head and the tail go together. Now, we have a way of attending to life, which we call conscious attention, and that is like a narrow crack in a fence. Our speech reflects it. You can only think of one thing at a time. And that is one of our ways of experiencing the world, bit by bit. For example, if you want to eat a chicken, you have to cut it up. And so you go to the grocery and you get a cut-up fryer, or else you cut it up at the table. Chickens do not come out of eggs as cut-up fryers. They come out the entire chicken. And so the world that we live in and we experience is not cut up into things and events. It all goes together in the same way that the bees and the flowers go together, only we don't notice this. We've got a way of thinking which splits it all up, and as a result of that, we think of ourselves, and so feel ourselves, as if we were something separate from the whole domain of nature. And to make a long story short, and to tell you the whole point right at the beginning, the disciplines of Taoism and of Zen propose to change your consciousness in such a way that you will no longer feel that you are an isolated unit locked up inside a bag of skin, but that you will actually experience the fact that your real self, the real you, is everything that there is, but concentrated and expressing itself at the point called your physical organism. There are of course intimations of this in the West, just as much as in the East. For example, to go back to something that is, partly superstitious, to my point of view, that is to say, astrology. Astrology does not seem to me to be an effective method of predicting the future, but it had some sense to it, in that when a child was born and people consulted the astrologers, what he did was to draw a map of the person's soul, his character. And this map consisted in a symbolic picture of the universe as it was at the moment when the child was born. Now, if the picture of that child's soul is the same thing as a picture of the universe, it shows that your soul is not in your body, your body is in your soul. And what your soul is the entire pattern of everything that there is, focused at the point you know as here and now. Just like you can focus the sun on a small point with a magnifying glass. Now, we know this to be true from the point of view of 20th century Western science. The science of ecology, which studies the relationship between organisms and environments, is very acutely aware in an intellectual way that an organism, whether human or animal or insect or plant, it doesn't matter what it is not merely something in an environment. Like you might say, you are in this room. But the organism and the environment behave together. They go with each other. In the sense of the saying in the Gospels, figs do not grow on thistles, nor grapes on thorns, has this application, that human beings do not grow in a cosmos which is unintelligent. If human beings are intelligent, and we define intelligence as the behavior of human beings, their way of thinking, feeling, and so on, you will not get an intelligent organism in an unintelligent environment. An apple tree doesn't grow apples all the time. Planets and stars do not produce life all the time, but every so often they do. So if an apple tree may be said to apple, this kind of universe in which we live peoples. It's a peopling world, and we go with it. But the problem, you see, is we don't feel that in the ordinary way. We feel strangers in the earth, and so talk about the conquest of nature and facing facts and all that nonsense. So there is proposed then here a transformation of our everyday consciousness, which is a new kind of sensation. The sensation that what is going on outside you is all one process with what's going inside you. And that you are all that there is. Now, you don't necessarily know this in the same way as you know something else out over there. Let me just take this illustration. Conscious attention, which is the faculty we use most to negotiate and get around, is rather like the headlight of a car. And the headlight illumines the road in front, but it does not shine on the wiring that connects the headlight with the battery and the battery with the engine. So in the same way, our conscious attention does not inspect the insides of our brains, unless you're a brain surgeon and you look at somebody else's brain and start to figure out how it works. So we are not ordinarily aware of how we're aware. And as a result of that, we don't understand our connection with the world, and we are unaware of what our real self is. Therefore, we get anxious. And we are afraid that death may be the end of us, and that somehow we will just pass out of this world altogether, and that'll be that. Well, this is, of course, the purest superstition, because everybody is indestructible. We, as individual organisms, as what we call physical bodies, we come and go like leaves on a tree, but there's the tree. And you are the tree. In the saying of Jesus, I am the vine, you are the branches. But that I am, before Abraham was I am, is the self, and is what the Hindus call the Brahman, and the Chinese call the Tao. And the Tao is curious word. It's done more or less like this. This part of it, this part of the character in here is the human eye. When you put this on top of it, it means the face or the self. And when you put this over it, it means a kind of a flame coming down. And so this part of it means intelligence. And this part, which is called the radical of the character, means rhythmic movement, going on and stopping. And so the basic idea in this is that life is a dance, a flowing dance, which consists of going on and stopping. That is to say, what the Chinese call yang and yin. Yang is the southern side, or the sunny side, of a mountain. And it's written this way. It is the sunny south side of a mountain, or the north bank of a river, wherever the sun falls. Yin is then the shadow side. Now imagine a mountain with only one side. Nobody can. A river with only one bank. Yang and yin. Now life, you see, is entirely a game of now you see it, now you don't. On off. A wave moves in crests and troughs. Now you can't have a wave unless you have both a crest and a trough. This is true in hydraulics, in terms of water, in electronics, in terms of physics. Without the one, you don't have the other. And so the relationship between these two things is called, this is the most important term there is in Taoist philosophy, is called mutual arising. And it's done like this. This is the most important idea in the whole thing. This character means reciprocal or mutual. And this is based on an old ideogram for a plant growing, arise, to come into being. And the fundamental idea is that the yang and the yin come into being together. You never find one without the other. There's a sort of secret conspiracy, like Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle. So that although they are different, like front and back are different, high and low are different, being and non-being are different, nevertheless they always go together. So that to be or not to be is not the question. See, it is the question for the West. For all existentialist thinking, to be or not to be, that really is the question. And therefore man must necessarily be anxious, trembling always. The moment he knows that he is, he faces the possibility that he might not be. And so he trembles. But for Chinese thought, to be and not to be, this is a phrase from the Tao Te Ching. They put it this way. They have, see, I'm going to amplify this. To be is written thus. And it also means to have. And not is written thus. So, to be, not to be, mutually come to arise. And now that's the point. Now, if you don't know that, you're anxious. Because you're always afraid that the darkness or the not being side might win over the light or the being side. But once you get the secret that they are inseparable, and that you couldn't have nothing without something, you can't have space without solids, and you can't have sounds without silence. Because what we call sound, if you have a continuous sound, or the sound of a note, is actually a vibration. And it's on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off at a terrific speed. So they see the world as the yang and the yin, the on and the off, as inseparable brothers, or lovers, if you want to put it that way, because they always say the yang is male and the yin is female. Inseparable lovers that are always there, although they may move at different vibrations. For example, the vibration of a sound, the yang and yin alternate very rapidly. But in terms of the birth and death of galaxies, they go from our point of view very, very slowly. Billions and billions of years. But it's the same process. Long or short makes no difference. And you see, therefore, that constitutes the fundamental Chinese view of the world. The Hindus have the same thing in other terms, but we're not discussing that today. So, because of this, then, the individual person comes to feel that he is not something strange in this world. He comes to feel that he's an expression of it, and that the world is himself rather than his physical body alone. His physical body, yes, that's you, and it has a certain degree of independence. But it's an expression of the whole thing in the same way as a wave is an expression of the ocean. See, the ocean waves. It says, you, I'm here. So in the same way, the whole cosmos waves with you and says, hi. And through the other waves, hello, glad to meet you. But we are all really the one center, expressing itself, playing in an infinite variety of ways. Now then you say, well, what does this lead to in terms of practical consequences? Well, it leads to a respect for the external world as one's own body. It leads to knowing how to get with it, knowing how to do things, to act with the grain rather than against the grain. The most important lesson that ancient China has to teach the modern West, the modern technological West, is how to get with it. Because you see, we have in technology this fantastic power for altering not only the external environment, but for altering ourselves. We can, by technology, by neurological surgery, and by drugs, and all sorts of things, we can change our own brains and begin to interfere technologically with our own characters, let alone the external world, the way we push that around. So in order to do this properly, you have to have a non-hostile feeling between yourself and what you're going to control. You have to feel one with it. Now let me give you just a certain practical illustration of this. All over California, there is a vast building going on because we have to take care of a very rapidly expanding population. We live in an absolutely gorgeous natural environment. In a place like this, here it is, just beautiful. Now, the most asinine thing for us to do would be to live in this lovely environment and spoil it by living in it. That's ridiculous. So if you are a skillful architect who works on the principle of the tradition of Taoist and Zen architecture, you go to your environment, let's say it's this great hill here, and you say to it, good morning. And you even bow so to it. And say, I want to live here, but what kind of house would you like to have on you? Well, the hill says, I would like a house that will disrupt me as little as possible, because I have a game going on here. I have a huge complexity of plants and insects and small animals that manage to keep this hill here. All these plants retain the hill. They prevent it from falling down. They prevent avalanches and all sorts of things like that. So the hill suggests to the sensitive artist or architect to build a house that does not interfere with the ecology of the hill. And so he thinks, now, how will I do this? And he comes up with a solution where the only alteration he need make to the hill is to build some sort of a road to the house. But actually what we're doing instead of that is we're going into our hills with bulldozers and we're terracing them so as to make room for houses that would be appropriate on flat land and put them in the hills. Now we need the flat land for agriculture. All flat land anywhere available in California should be farmed, and people should live in the hills. But in order to do that, we've got to understand how to treat hills. You see? So if you look at the way the hills on the north side and the east side of Kyoto have been civilized, why, they never did any of that thing. They have the most beautiful way of concealing houses in the hills so that you hardly know they're there. They don't have any bulldozers. And the way the farmers have adapted their land to the landscape and done contour farming in the hills, it's exquisite. So that a country of which 80% of the land is non-arable because it's mountain, has been made, in combination with the sea, 80% self-supporting. It's simply fantastic. They farm the sea, they eat seaweeds and things that we don't eat. And all along the California coast, there is a fantastic abundance of uneaten food. Kelp. If you know how to cook it, it's just great. But we have to learn these lessons, you see, in order to get by, because we're going to have a terrible time if we don't learn them. So this is the principle that is called in Taoist philosophy Wu Wei. And this, again, second to this other expression here that I gave you, mutually arising. Wu Wei, we'll do it this way, Wu, again, this is the not character, the negative. Wei, this means not to force things. That's the best English translation I've come to. It's sometimes translated not doing, no artificiality, no interference. But our word forcing, as when a forced laugh, forcing a lock, forced behavior, forced kindness, forced love, in that sense forcing, don't force it. So it means action in accordance with the character of the moment and of the circumstances in which you're acting. You see, you can't not interfere with the world. Everything you do interferes with your environment. And nobody knows this better than a chemist or physicist, because he realizes, especially the physicist, that whenever he so much as inspects the behavior of electrons, the things he has to do to inspect their behavior alter the way in which they behave. In other words, shine a light on something to look at it, and that bombardment of light affects it, especially at the nuclear level. So in another way, let's say you put fertilizers in the soil, and that alters the ground. Now, the ground that has had fertilizers put into it is not the same kind of ground as ground that hasn't. You understood the ground before you put the fertilizers in it and decided what to put in. But after you've put in it, you've got to study it all over again to see what's happened, to know what to do next time. And you see, this constantly keeps moving. To know things is to change them. You cannot not interfere. So the idea is to learn how to interfere skillfully. That's the meaning of Wu Wei. Now then, there comes one other term that I have to discuss with you, that is, this thing is you see, mutually arising. In other words, everything goes together, You go together with your environment in such a way that you and your environment are one being. This term, wu wei, not interfering, how to act with the grain. And then there's one other thing that has to be understood, which goes into this term is not found in ancient Taoism, but it is found in Zen. It comes in later Chinese philosophy. But it's based historically on the Taoist view of the world. And this is the word li. Li. Now this is a very fascinating expression. It means, originally, markings in jade, grain in wood, and fiber in muscle. Western scholars have translated it reason or principle, but this isn't very good. It doesn't give the feeling of it. Li is the word used to designate the character of the order of nature. And so our scholars tend to translate it the laws of nature. See? But the Chinese have no word that we can correctly translate as the laws of nature, because they don't look upon nature as obeying laws. They look upon it as orderly, but not legal. They do have a word for law, and the word and this character, when it was originally a picture, was like this. That is a sacrificial iron cauldron with a knife beside it. Well, many, many centuries ago, there was a certain emperor who wrote the laws of the country, had them caused to be inscribed on the sacrificial cauldrons, so that when the people came to offer sacrifices, they would read the laws inscribed on the cauldrons. But he was told by his sages that that was a very wrong thing to do, because if you write the laws down, people start fighting. And we know this, don't we, all too well. See, in our jurisprudence, lawyers will talk in their conversation about different judges. They will say, well, this kind of man has a good sense of law. He knows the book, but he has no sense of equity. He does everything by the book. Whereas a good judge has a sense of equity, which means that he knows that circumstances alter cases. But every case is different. And he is a kind of person, we would say, who has an innate sense of fair play. Now, you cannot write down the rules of fair play. It's too complicated to be put into words. Just in the same way exactly that we cannot describe our own nervous system. It's too complicated. And will always elude us, although we'll get somewhere near it. All right, now, the judge who understands equity goes beyond law, because he is informed with this principle, li, and li, meaning the markings in jade, is like this. When you get a piece of jade and look at its markings, you don't think of them as chaotic. When you see a dirty old ashtray with cigarette butts in it and rolled up bits of paper and pieces of Kleenex and things that everybody's throw away, you know that that's a mess. And you don't want that kind of a mess around. You get rid of it. But when you look at the patterns on rocks, or the shapes of clouds, or the outlines of trees, you've got something which isn't orderly in the sense of being symmetrical. It doesn't form fours, you know? But you know it's beautiful. And so the painter, in the Western tradition, has copied clouds and trees, and everybody, when he copies clouds and trees, they say, well, that's a picture, I know what that's about. But clouds don't mean anything. They're not a picture of anything, they're just clouds, they're just clouding. And so the poem Blue mountains are spontaneously blue mountains. White clouds are spontaneously white clouds. They just do that, you see. That's their game. But they are definitely something that we recognize as having an order and not being chaos. But we can't quite pin down wherein that order consists. We know it is order. And we can analyze it physically, chemically, and we can find out a lot about the behavior of surface tensions, which are a way of explaining why bubbles in water form the way they do, why clouds form the way they do, etc., etc., etc. But what we get is only an approximation to it. Like, for example, when you measure a piece of land, you're a surveyor, and you reduce it to so many small triangles, and you measure those triangles, and that measures the land. That's only an approximation to what's actually there. Fine, so far so good, but we never quite get it. So there is this always ungraspable, indefinable principle of order in things, which is Li. And that explains why Chinese art appreciates in all that it does a certain element of the uncontrolled. Now you see, when you use, for example, a brush, let's take it right here, or here, the brush runs a little dry, and you're at the mercy of the hairs of this brush. Now some painters like to let everything go wild. In a certain sense, the man who did that has let things go pretty wild. See? But what the ideal that they're aiming at is, and which you have to be a tremendous master to accomplish, is to let it go wild within limits. To create a situation which overall is orderly, but allows for the unexpected, random surprises. And so they look upon our daily life in exactly the same way. I was talking about bees earlier on, and somebody suggested to me the other day that bees are quite remarkable for this reason. That every bee does exactly what it feels like doing, and yet it's all orderly. Now imagine that. Supposing you could get up at the beginning of the day and live in such a way that you did just exactly what you personally wanted to do. You didn't take any attention about what anybody else thought of doing, or schedules or anything like that. You did just what you felt like. But it so turned out that what you felt like was what everybody else felt like doing with you. And it was an orderly performance. Well, the bees have it. And so to follow the Tao is to acquire the art of doing exactly what you feel like doing. And at the same time, it's Wu Wei in the sense that it does not force anything or anybody or impose on. Now, you see what a marvelous accomplishment that is. But I have to give you, for this morning, one other term that is important to understand this. To do that, to act naturally, you have to understand this word, which in Chinese is called zirang. That which is so, this means so, this means self. Self-so. What is so of itself? This is pronounced zi, this rang. And this we translate into English nature, although it's very unlike our word nature. It means what happens without being shoved, without being forced. What is so of itself? What happens naturally? We do have it in that sense. It comes naturally when we say that. It's second nature. Something like that. When we say that, we get this thing. So the Tao there's a passage in Lao Tzu's writing where he says, the Tao's method is to be so of itself. Now, we have had an image of the universe in which it's run by somebody. The Lord God is in control. And he made it all, he engineered it all, he understands all about it, and he remains in control. The Chinese is exactly the opposite. It looks upon the universe as not being in control at all, but as being perfectly orderly of itself. So he says the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when good things are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. So there's a poem in Zen which says, entering the forest, he does not disturb a blade of grass. Entering the water, he doesn't make a ripple. Because he was so in accord with the scene, and he flowed so easy through it, that nobody noticed. When there's a piece of calligraphy on the other side of that board there, which is done by Saburo Hasegawa. It's the Chinese characters, 1, 2, 3. And hung this up in my office and said to Hasegawa, well, Dr. Suzuki is coming tomorrow, and I'm going to have this up here for him to see. Dr. Suzuki, as you know, is the great Zen scholar. And Hasegawa said, I hope he won't notice it. And you know, this wasn't modesty. It's saying if I had done it really well, he wouldn't notice it. So there's a kind of anonymity in this.
You've been listening to Alan Watts in Zen and the Art of the Controlled Accident. This recording and podcast was produced in cooperation between the Alan Watts Organization and the Ram Dass Be Here Now podcast network. Our music today is by Zakir Hussain from the Rhythm Experience album released by Moment Records. Please visit the alanwatts.org site and also the Art of Alan Watts site for playful interaction with the themes that Alan expressed today.
I'm about to give my mom the surprise of her life. Let's see if she forgives me. Mother, where are you?
I'm in the closet.
Oh my God!
Welcome to Being in the Way. I'm your host, Mark Watts, and this is the Alan Watts Podcast. And today we're going to listen to a really great talk. It was recorded in Ojai, California, and it's called Zen and the Art of the Controlled Accident. And it really dives deeply into my father's aesthetic appreciation of Zen. And to celebrate this, we've also created a new web presence called The Art of Alan Watts. And you can find it linked from the alanwatts.org website. But you'll be able to experience some of the materials that inspired him, and then also contemporary interpretations and posters and all of that. So in this way, we're celebrating my father's appreciation of Zen aesthetics and invite you to join us to look around and see what's going on. And so now for today's podcast, Zen and the Art of the Controlled Accident, recorded in Ojai, California, here's Alan Watts.
I have entitled this seminar, Zen Buddhism and the Art of Controlled Accidents. And this is going to involve not only the aesthetic domain of the arts, but also what we might call spontaneity in living. And so I've got to begin by going back to the earliest source of Zen, which is not actually Buddhism, but the Chinese philosophy known as Taoism. The way of the Tao, that is spelled in English T-A-O, but by Mandarin speakers pronounced approximately Tao. The scholars who transliterated these words had a way of transliterating them so that only if you were in the know and were a scholar could you pronounce them properly. They might just as well have spelled it D-A-O or D-O-W. Now, in order to understand Taoism, which originates in China, probably later than Confucius, about 400 BC, although the materials out of which this philosophy was evolved probably go back very much further. The Tao is a way of life, and the word Tao means the way, approximately, the course of nature, the flow of things. And in order to understand this point of view, we have to make a very, very radical adjustment in our ordinary common sense. Not all Chinese people by any means understand this, but it has, in a way, leaked into the general culture of China over the centuries, so that even, so, shall we say, the man in the street has some glimmer of what it's about. But it involves one absolutely radical transformation in our ordinary, everyday common sense. And I have to explain this from the beginning. Because Zen and Taoism in common involve not a system of doctrine, not a set of beliefs as we ordinarily understand religion. They involve a transformation of your consciousness. That is to say, of the way in which you experience your own existence at every moment. One might say that the average individual, not only in the West but also in the East, has a feeling of himself as separate from other people and from the earth itself and from the space and the stars and everything around the earth. He feels this in such a way that it's expressed in all the phrases of common speech. We talk about coming into the world. I came into this world. As a matter of fact, you didn't. You came out of it. Just in the same way as an apple comes out of an apple tree, as an expression of the apple tree. We say, I'm facing facts. As if facts, that is to say, the things going on in nature around you, was something you confronted as a being alien from, different from those facts, and meeting them as if they were total strangers. We talk about the conquest of nature as a phrase expressing man's control over his environment, which is a very hostile phrase. Now, in order to get the Chinese point of view, may I be so simple as to take you back to the old lesson about the bees and the flowers. Not to illustrate how sex works, but to illustrate the very fundamental property of nature. There are no flowers where there are no insects. There are...
And sleep all the way down, all the way down.
If you want to manifest more success and abundance into your life, hypnosis is... Welcome to Being in the Way with Alan Watts. I'm Mark Watts, your host, and today's talk is on being God, which was recorded in 1971 in New York City at a conference on Western therapy and Eastern religions. Like last week's talk, Zen Bones, it's a big hall presentation given to hundreds of people who attended the conference. And in it, my father explores both Western therapy and Western religions in relationship to the mystical experiences or altered states that are the basis of Eastern religions. He points out that neither Western therapy nor Western religions are particularly equipped to deal with individuals who've had these experiences. And in the course of the talk, he He invites everyone there to participate with him in a clinical experiment in which he positions himself as a patient who's had one of these experiences and believes himself to be God, and invites the audience to ask any questions they like. The results are lively, at times hilarious, and definitely enlightening as he pivots from idea to idea and question to question and delivers a remarkable performance. And now here's Alan Watts in On Being God.
Between Western psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy, and the so-called religions of Asia, there is common ground because both are interested in changing states of human consciousness. Whereas institutional Western religion, Christianity, Judaism, and even Islam, are relatively less interested in this matter. Western religions are more concerned with behavior, doctrine, and belief than with any transformation of the way in which we are aware of ourselves and of the world. But this matter concerns psychiatry and psychology very much. Only those states of consciousness which are not normal are usually treated in Western psychology as being in some way sick. There are, of course, exceptions to this, and there have increasingly been exceptions. In the work of Jung, and to some extent even of Grodek, of Prinzhorn, of more modern people, Rogers and Ronald Lang. Changing consciousness is often looked upon as a form of therapy. But in general, different states of consciousness from the normal are regarded as a form of sickness. And therefore, official and institutional psychiatry constitutes itself the guardian of sanity and of socially approved experience of reality. And very often it seems to me that reality appears rather much the way the world is seen on a bleak Monday morning. In this official doctrine, I might even say dogma, of what reality is. Because after all, we know that our science, such as it is of psychology, is founded in the scientific naturalism of the 19th century. And the metaphysical and mythological assumptions of that science still underlie a great deal of psychological thinking, in behaviorism eminently, but also to a large extent in official psychoanalysis. Indeed, one might say that psychoanalysis is based on Newtonian mechanics and in fact could be called psychohydraulics. Not that that analogy is altogether inappropriate, because there are certainly respects in which our psychic life flows and exhibits the dynamics of water. But of course we want to know what kind of water. And for the scientific naturalism of the 19th century, the basic energies of nature were considered to be very much inferior to human consciousness in quality. Ernst Haeckel, a biologist of that time, would think of the energy of the universe as blind energy. And correspondingly, it seems to me that Freud thought of the libido as essentially blind, unconscious energy, embodying only a kind of formless, unstructured, and insatiable lust. This is a generalization. Some modification in that thinking is, of course, possible. But the tendency is to regard all that which lies below the surface of human consciousness as being less evolved, because you must remember that this was also the time of Darwin's theories of evolution, of seeing the human mind as a fortuitous development from much more primitive forms of life, coming forth by purely mechanical processes, by natural selection and by the survival of the fittest. And therefore, man was in general seen as a fluke of nature, an embodiment of reason, emotion, and values, for which the more basic processes of nature had no sympathy and about which they did not care. If, therefore, the human race is to flourish, we must take charge of evolution. It can no longer be left to spontaneous process, but it must be directed by human ingenuity, despite the fact that although our brains are capable of dealing with a colossal number of variables at once, our conscious attention is not. Most people cannot consider more than 3 variables at the same time without using a pencil. And this shows that in many ways the scanning process of man's conscious attention is very inadequate for dealing with the infinitely many variables, the multidimensional processes of the natural universe. However, a serious attempt has been made, and scientific naturalism issued in a fantastic fight with nature. In this whole notion of the conquest and subordination of nature, which has, as a matter of fact, very ancient, non-scientific and biblical origins, with the idea of man as the head and chief and ruler of nature in the image of God. And the time has now dawned upon us all when our attempts to beat nature into submission are having alarming results, because we see that it's very dangerous to mess around with processes that we don't understand, that have enormous numbers of variables, and we begin to wonder whether we hadn't better let well enough alone. At the same time, although I said that Western psychology had more in common, or more common interest with Oriental religion than it does with Western religion, there is a sense in which psychiatry and psychotherapy are becoming the religion of the West. Psychoanalysis has much in common with the forms and procedures of institutional religion. There is, for example, apostolic succession, the passing down of mana, of qualified power to practice therapy, from the father founder, Sigmund Freud, through his immediate apostles, to an enormous company of archbishops and bishops, among whom there are, of course, as there were with Christianity, heresiarchs, such as Jung and Grodek and Rank and Reich. And the heresiarchs are duly excommunicated and anathematized. There are rituals, as there are also rituals with religion. There is the sacrament of the couch. There is the spiritual discipline of free association. There is the mystic knowledge of the interpretation of dreams. And there are also the two great symbolic fetishes, the long one and the round one. Now, it's extraordinarily easy to make fun of all this. And we must not forget that we owe a tremendous debt to Freud, if for nothing else than pointing out that much of ourselves of which we are aware in terms of the conscious ego is not really ourselves. It is something superficial. However we define its nature, it is superficial. And the realities of human life are not under the gaze of its scanning process, at least not in the ordinary way. And that was a tremendous revelation. There's no question about that. But one sees troublesome signs when the doctrines and processes of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and so forth become officialized. And I think Thomas Sass, in his books, The Myth of Mental Illness and The Manufacture of Madness, is pointing out something extremely important to us, which is that, in effect, the psychological official of today is the priest, and that he is beginning to exercise the same sort of controls over human life as were exercised by the church in the Middle Ages. So that a professor of psychiatry at Columbia or Harvard or Yale medical schools has today the same sort of intellectual respectability and authority as the professor of theology at the University of Toledo or Padua would have had in the year 1400. Now you must realize that the theologians of those days not simply believed in their cosmology and the theology, they almost knew it was true in the same way that our scientists know certain things to be true. Despite the fact that they change their opinions very often, while they hold them, they have in effect the force of dogma, as witness the anathematization of Velikovsky for his uncomfortable ideas. And therefore, there are heresies existing today which are persecuted in the same way as heresies were persecuted by the Holy Inquisition. And they are persecuted out of kindness, in exactly the same way that the Holy Inquisition persecuted heresy out of kindness and deep concern for human beings. That is unimaginable to us, but it was so. For after all, if you seriously believe that someone who did not hold the Catholic faith and who voluntarily rejected it would be tortured physically and spiritually forever and ever and ever in hell, you would resort to almost any means to preserve a fellow human being from such a fate, especially if the complaint or disease of heresy from which he suffered was infectious. You would first of all reason with him. And if he was not responsive to reason, you would resort to abuse and to forceful argument. And if he was not responsive to that, you would give him shock treatment and bang him about. If that didn't work, the thumb screw and the rack and the Iron Maiden. And if that didn't work, as a last desperate resort, you would burn him at the stake in the pious hope that in the midst of those searing fires he would think better and make a last act of perfect contrition, and so be rescued from everlasting damnation. And you did all this in the spirit of this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you, in the spirit of a surgeon who is very, very sorry indeed that he has to make you undergo this extremely painful operation. But it is in your best interests, and there really is at least a 50-50 chance that you may survive. And so, therefore, in perfectly scientific medical spirit, people may be very arbitrarily and without due process deprived of their civil rights, incarcerated in prisons that are in many cases much worse than
to watch people to see if they will become offenders, quote unquote. And she is completely accurate.
Yeah, it's called the school to prison pipeline.
Right. Are they watching them to see if they will be offenders, or are they training them? Right. Because you also have certain judges, right? So you have judges, like whether it's controversial or not, but you have Judge Joe Brown that had a low recidivism rate because instead of giving juvenile sentence.
It's hilarious to me that you're suggesting that you're like exercising proper like rigor here, intellectual rigor, by trusting AI hallucinations. Like, you're actually an insane person. Like, if you just ask the AI, it will admit it made a mistake, and you're like, well, I'm sitting here, I don't care about the rhetoric, I just want to, exercise proper scrutiny about the information. And the way you're doing that is by trusting AI hallucinations. Like, you're a clown, you're like a cartoon character.
Right. So, Alan, you do realize that the DeepSeek, et cetera, they can make mistakes, right? You realize that, right?
Again, it's just goofy.
Just hop on the Acme rocket and blast off into space.
Hold on. So here's what I'm saying, Andrew. Here's what I'm saying. There's no source that you could pull up that says 31 votes were needed. It says 2/3. We agree on that. But what I'm saying is, so you're gonna have places that might say 33 was needed. But I've never read a source that said 31 was needed. And so I'm also filtering through this discrepancy. You see what I'm saying? So I'm just reading through this.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I'm just filtering through the information to read. I don't care about all this other shit everybody is talking about. I'm actually filtering through rigorously to make sure I understand the facts.
Well, we still need the source, right? Like a source that just tells us exactly that, 2/3 of 46 rounded up is 33, or 31, sorry. Yeah, we don't have any, so we have calculators, right? But those, like, if AI isn't reliable, then neither are calculators.
Is he trying to say 2/3? Is he trying to say that 2/3 is just
You can't just say anything.
No. Well, no, hold on. Is it just like is it like the closest approximation is 2/3, but the exact number is actually 33? Is that I mean, like, can you find a source that actually says 31? Because it should be somewhere. Somebody should be able to say that. Maybe you can make DeepSeek say it. Okay, well.
Why would there be such a source then? Like, it's completely ridiculous.
I think there's no primary source that tells us how to do arithmetic, right? Like, unless you call the Bible.
Deepak, stop. I love you.
Andrew, he agrees that 2/3 were necessary, were minimum necessary number of votes, and he agrees that there were 46 nations that voted. But he doesn't think that the right way to calculate the number of votes is 2/3 times 46. He thinks it's some other completely mysterious.
I understand. What I'm saying is when this 2/3 claim is made, or when that 2/3,
criminals, and generally left to rot, be neglected and ignored, and when bumptious, given shock treatment or put in solitary confinement. For what? Because they have unorthodox and heretical states of consciousness. A lot of these people are not dangerous until provoked into being dangerous by being ignored, by being treated as machines, and generally defined as non-human. And if you are defined as non-human, there's precious little you can do about it. Because everything you say that sounds human will be taken as a kind of utterance of a mechanical man, as imitating humanness out of lunatic cunning. You will be suspicious. Everything you say will be listened to in a different way and with different ears. And you will have one hell of a time talking yourself out of it. Because there really are no rules as to what one must do when incarcerated for having unorthodox consciousness. There is no clear
root to repentance. And this is found likewise in jails, where people are incarcerated on 1 to 10-year sentences, as in places like Vacaville, California, where when I visited such prisons, young men have come to me in perfect desperation, saying, I don't know what's happened to me, because I want to live like a decent citizen. I know I've done things that are wrong, but I simply don't know what is expected of me here. If I try to do what's expected, they say I'm compliant. And that seems to be some sort of a sickness. Thomas Sass drew attention to this when he quoted a discussion of the types of school children who may very well need therapy. There were overachieving children. There were underachieving children. There were children who exhibited erratic patterns. There were children who were sort of dully mediocre. In fact, every sort of child can be given a diagnostic name for his behavior which sounds sick. As Jung once suggested, life itself is a disease with a very poor prognosis. It lingers on for years and invariably ends with death. And I submit that in our present knowledge of the human mind, such power in the hands of psychiatrists is amazingly dangerous. For I would suggest that today we know about as much concerning the human mind as we knew about the galaxy in 1300. And that while there are indeed individuals who are certainly able to perform psychotherapy, it is the sheerest arrogance for anybody to say that he is officially qualified to do so. We do not know how it is done, just as we do not know, really, how musical, artistic, and literary genius is done. You cannot really teach it. You can put the tools for doing these things into people's hands, and you can show them how to use the tools. But whether they will use those tools with genius is quite unpredictable. And this is above all true of the art of psychotherapy. We don't know how it's done. We've got some vague ideas. There probably are some people who, by reason of their mental derangement, are...
Hope you're having a great Friday night. This is called Alan Watts on Being God, Being in the Way.
Alan Watts. This shit is resonating with me. It's hitting me deep.
It's very good. You know, you go to these clown house rooms and it's just like, I feel so bad for these people. Are they all really this stupid? I mean, it's horrible.
You know, I was thinking that exact same thing because, like, when you go into rooms sometimes and you say the low IQ dumb thing, and what Alan Watts is saying within his speech, what really hit me was when he said psychiatry and psychoanalysis is the West's religion. That hit me very deep because there's a lot of people that need therapy refuse to get it.
There's a lot of people that need to read some books and go to the fucking gym.
Probably not qualified to perform because they are maybe out just to make other people into messes. But to say that there are certain standards and certain examinations that can be passed and certificates that can be issued, which do indeed qualify people for this work, is, I think, pernicious nonsense. And is used, of course, out of economic self-interest when those who consider themselves official therapists run into competition. The same was done by religion. I was talking, imagine it, to a Buddhist priest in Thailand some years ago. I was looking at some books in a bookshop in the precincts of a Buddhist temple. And I was wandering over, and I noticed a book on a certain form of Buddhist meditation. And I murmured, Satipatthana, which is the name of a certain kind of Buddhist meditation. And a voice suddenly said to me, you practice Satipatthana? I looked up, and there was a skinny Buddhist monk in a yellow robe with rather red eyes looking at me. I said, not exactly Satipatthana. I use a different method. It's called Zen. Oh, Satipatthana, not Zen. I said, oh, well, it's something like it, isn't it? No. Well, it's rather like yoga, I said, isn't it? Not yoga. No. Satipatthana different. Only right way. Well, look, I said to him, I have a lot of Roman Catholic friends who tell me that their way is the only right way. Who am I to believe? You know, I said, you're like someone who's got a ferry boat for crossing the river. I used the Buddhist simile. And another fellow down the stream has opened up ferry business. And you go to the government and say, he's not authorized to operate a ferry boat because he's competition to you. Let all operate ferry boats who will. And if you haven't got the sense to stay off one that sinks, it's your fault. And after all, I could say to him, you believe that everything that happens to you is your own karma. So why worry? But now, it's so interesting that since official psychiatry, and I underline that word official because I hope those of you in this audience who are therapists will regard yourselves as unofficial. At least that'll give you an out. But nevertheless, official psychiatry has curious things in common with Western religion, as well as with Eastern. With Eastern, I said, only insofar as it has an interest in states of consciousness and inclines to regard other states of consciousness than the ordinary as sick. But it has one very important feature in common with Western religion. And to that, we have to go a little bit into Western religious history and ask ourselves what in Western religion, and especially in Christianity, and this goes also for Judaism, Islam, what is the great heresy? Curiously enough, the great heresy was first in the West committed by no less a person than Jesus Christ, who believed himself to be God. This, of course, will be unquestionably true if you think that the Gospel of St. John has historical value. It's a little vaguer in the Synoptic Gospels, but if you read the Gospel of St. John, there is absolutely no doubt about it, for he said, I and the Father are one. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. He said all that, according to this gospel. And that is something that in the Western world you are not supposed to say. Especially you are not supposed to believe it. And naturally it was very difficult for Jesus, because he was saying all this in the context of the Hebrew culture. And he tried to find language in the Hebrew scriptures with which to express his state of consciousness, because he had an unusual state of consciousness. As I read it, he had cosmic consciousness, otherwise known as mystical experience, otherwise known as moksha, nirvana, bodhi, satori, fana elvana, or what you will. And that happens to people. It has happened as far back as we know. It happens all over the world and in all cultures. We don't know very much about it. We don't really know ways in which to make it happen, because it seems to be of the nature of it that it is a spontaneous surprise. But it unquestionably happens. And most people keep their mouths shut about it when it does. I had a friend who, in the middle of having a stroke, had this illumination. And he said to me, I fear to speak to my friends of this, but it was the most beautiful experience. I shall never be afraid of death. In fact, I recommend everyone to have a stroke. This was my friend Jean Varda, lately deceased Greek painter. But Jesus certainly had this transformation of consciousness. And he was crucified for it. Why? Because he had committed an act of insubordination and treason against the cosmic government. Because if you believe that God is a monarch, an absolute, omniscient, and omnipotent authority, shall we say a sort of cosmic ego, then to claim to be that is to introduce democracy into the kingdom of heaven, to usurp divine authority, and to speak in its name without proper authorization. And they asked Jesus, by what authority do you speak? Of heaven or of men? And he was tricky about answering that one. He said, by what authority did John the Baptist speak? And they were nervous about answering that one. He could have asked, by what authority did Isaiah speak, etc., or Moses. But Moses became official authority. And if you could wangle it that what you said was simply an extension of what Moses said, because Rabbi so-and-so said it, who got it from Rabbi so-and-so, who got it from Rabbi so-and-so, who got it from Moses, then it's okay. Notice this, that to be an authority today in the academic world depends on documentation. It's not enough to say, for I say unto you, you must put in your footnotes. And the more the footnotes, the more the authority, obviously. So, our dissertations tend to be books about books, about books about books, and our libraries multiply by mitosis. So, when somebody speaks as an authority, that means speaks as the author. That's all it means. It's a statement of which you are the author, and therefore for which you assume responsibility. That is to speak with authority. And to be original is likewise not to be freaky,